Clara Voss was 16 years old when the blizzard struck with a fury that erased the world in seconds. She had exactly enough time to grab her horse's reins and run for the cave. She'd been checking trap lines when the temperature plunged to 20 degrees in minutes. The sky bruised to purple-black. The wind roared down from the north like something ancient and ravenous. And the snow, it didn't fall. It attacked horizontal, blinding lethal. "Come on, Ember," Clara shouted to her chestnut mare, pulling her toward the limestone cliff she knew lay somewhere ahead in the whiteout. "The cave. We have to reach the cave." Ember followed, trusting her rider even when she could see no farther than her own nose. Clara navigated by memory and instinct, knowing that missing the entrance meant death for both of them within the hour. This was no ordinary snowstorm. This was a killer blizzard, the kind that buried entire homesteads and left frozen bodies for spring thaw to reveal. Then she saw it, the dark gap in the wall of white, the cave mouth, and beyond it the cabin she had built inside the cave, the structure everyone in Silver Ridge had mocked for a full year. Voss's cave castle, they called it, the Hermit's Hole, a home that made no sense to people who believed houses belonged on flat ground beneath open sky, not tucked into limestone like a bird's nest. Clara led Ember through the narrow entrance. Instantly, the howling wind cut off. The temperature, though still cold, rose noticeably. No longer the killing chill outside. The cave's natural protection was already saving them. She guided the mare deeper, past the tight passage, into the large chamber where her cabin stood, a solid log structure built entirely within the cave, sheltered by millions of years of stone above and around it. The cabin door was 20 feet from the entrance, creating a buffer zone. She settled Ember into the small stable area she'd built alongside the cabin, also inside the cave, and threw blankets over the mare's steaming back. "Good girl," Clara murmured, checking her over. "We made it." Through the cabin's real glass window, one she packed in with great care, she could see the cave entrance. Beyond it was nothing but white fury. The blizzard that would later be called the worst in Montana history had arrived, and it would rage for 5 full days. But inside the cave, inside her cabin, Clara was safe. She had firewood stacked in the dry chamber, food stores that stayed cold but never froze thanks to the cave's steady temperature, water from a spring that flowed year-round deeper in the system, shelter no wind could touch, no snow could bury, and no cold could fully penetrate. The home everyone had laughed at was about to prove its worth. To understand why a young woman would spend a year building a cabin inside a cave while her neighbors mocked her, you have to go back to the beginning. It started the previous spring when Clara purchased the old Callahan property, 20 acres of rough, rocky land that included a large limestone cave system. Most people thought the land was worthless. Farming was impossible on the stone. The cave was merely a curiosity. "What are you planning to do with that?" Sheriff Morrison asked when Clara filed the deed. "Build a home," she replied. "Where?" "I don't see any flat ground out there." "Inside the cave." Morrison stared. "Inside the cave? You mean a cabin inside the cave?" "Exactly that." The news spread through Silver Ridge like wildfire. Clara Voss, the quiet young woman who had arrived the previous fall with money earned from railroad survey work, was going to build a cabin inside a cave instead of on normal land like a sensible person. "That's insane," declared Mayor Thompson at the saloon. "Why would anyone choose to live a cave?" "Because caves provide what open ground doesn't," Clara tried to explain at the town meeting. "Constant temperature year-round, protection from wind, rain, snow, natural humidity control, and most importantly, shelter from extreme weather. But it's a cave." Victoria Hanson protested. "Dark, damp, probably full of bats. That's not civilized. The chamber I'm using is dry and well ventilated. Yes, I'll deal with some bats, but they eat insects. As for light, I'll have windows and lamps. The temperature stays around 55 degrees year-round, warmer than winter outside, cooler than summer." "What about flooding?" someone asked. "Caves flood. Not this one. It's elevated above the floodplain. I've surveyed the drainage. Water flows past it, not into it." For every objection, Clara had an answer. But people had already decided building in a cave was madness. Clara Voss was wasting time and money on a project doomed to fail. Construction began in late spring and provided endless entertainment for the town. Clara's first task was clearing the main chamber, removing loose rocks, leveling the floor, and assessing ceiling stability. The cave was vast. The chamber she chose was over 30 feet wide and 20 feet high, with a naturally arched ceiling stable for millennia. She worked alone day after day, with only Ember for company, hauling timber she'd cut and milled herself, shaping logs, raising walls inside the stone embrace. The town watched, waiting for the moment she would admit defeat. They were still waiting when the blizzard arrived, and Clara, safe inside her cave cabin with Ember stabled nearby, allowed herself the smallest, quietest smile. She had been right all along. Clara's cave refuge became the running joke in Silver Ridge from the moment word spread. "Boss is playing caveman," Mayor Thompson declared at the saloon, drawing roars of laughter. "Someone ought to tell the girl we evolved past living in holes. Maybe she thinks she's a bear, planning to hibernate all winter long." The mockery followed her everywhere. Children chanted "Cave Girl Clara" when she rode into town for supplies. Men at the general store shook their heads and muttered about wasted youth. Women whispered that no man would ever court a girl who chose to live like a wild thing in the dark. But Clara continued, ignoring the ridicule with the same quiet focus she applied to everything. She understood what they could not or would not see. The cave was not a step backward into primitiveness. It was a natural fortress with properties no ordinary cabin could match. Constant temperature, complete protection from wind and snow, natural ventilation, and unbreakable shelter against the worst Montana could throw. The cabin itself rose with meticulous craftsmanship. Clara selected the straightest lodgepole pine from her land, milled the logs herself with a borrowed saw, and raised solid walls that stood like a house nested inside a greater house of stone. The roof sloped gently to shed the rare drip that found its way through cracks high above. She fitted a sturdy door, cut 2 real glass windows facing the cave entrance for precious daylight, and even built a small covered porch area where she could sit and watch Ember graze in the outer chamber on milder days. The chimney was her cleverest solution, a natural fissure in the cave ceiling that vented upward to the surface. She had tested it for weeks with small fires, adjusting stones to improve draw, until smoke rose clean and invisible, leaving no trace for prying eyes outside. For Ember, she constructed a proper stable beside the cabin, partitioned off with mangers for hay, a water trough fed by the cave spring, and thick bedding of pine needles and blankets. The mayor would never again stand exposed to biting wind or drifting snow. "He's building a whole homestead in a hole in the ground," people marveled, half in disbelief, half in amusement. "What happens when the roof falls in and buries her?" "That cave has stood for thousands of years," Clara answered calmly when the question reached her. "It will stand thousands more. Limestone doesn't collapse without cause, and I'm giving it none." The work consumed the entire summer and stretched into fall. Day after day, Clara labored alone, hauling timber, shaping logs, and raising walls inside the vast stone chamber. Ember was her only constant companion, grazing in the outer cave or standing patiently while Clara worked. Slowly the refuge took shape. Storage alcoves carved into natural niches for dry goods, a root cellar in a deeper, cooler chamber where temperature never fluctuated, a water collection system channeling the year-round spring into barrels, and ventilation shafts exploiting the cave's own gentle airflow to keep the air fresh. By late fall, the cabin stood complete, strange and beautiful in its setting, a solid log home glowing warmly inside a cathedral of stone. It looked like something from an old frontier tale, yet it was comfortable, surprisingly bright from windows and oil lamps, and remarkably cozy even as nights grew sharp outside. Clara moved in with Ember, living in her cave refuge, while Silver Ridge watched and waited for the inevitable failure. "Give it one winter," they predicted confidently. "She'll come crawling back to civilization when the dark drives her mad or the damp rots her lungs." Winter came, and Clara thrived. The cave's steady temperature meant her cabin stayed warm, with astonishingly little firewood. Wind never rattled her door. Snow never burdened her roof. Ember remained healthy and content in the protected stable, her coat glossy, her eyes bright. Clara's store stayed perfect. No freezing, no spoiling. No desperate scrambling for supplies in waist-deep drifts. "It's unnatural," some muttered uneasily, catching faint wisps of smoke rising from the hidden hillside vent on still days. "It's practical," Clara replied whenever asked. "I'm using shelter nature perfected long before we arrived. Why fight the elements when you can live where they cannot reach you?" Comfort, however, was not the quality that would silence the doubters. That proof came later, when the worst blizzard in recorded Montana history revealed that sometimes the oldest shelters are the strongest. The warning signs appeared the day before. A sharp plunge on the barometer Clara kept inside her cabin, birds vanishing from the ridges, air crackling with strange electricity, and Ember restless and pacing her stable despite extra feed. "Big storm coming," Clara murmured, running final checks on supplies. She had plenty, food laid in during fall, firewood stacked high in dry alcoves, water barrels full from the spring, and hay enough for Ember through the longest winter. She was ready. What she could not have known was that this storm would be catastrophic, the kind that rewrote record books and local history alike. The blizzard struck that afternoon exactly as it had at the beginning, catching Clara out on her trap lines, but close enough to the cave mouth to reach safety. Temperature plummeted to 30 below zero. Winds topped 60 miles an hour with vicious gusts. Snow fell so thick, visibility vanished to arm's length. In Silver Ridge, 5 miles distant, people were trapped. Those caught caught outside froze before reaching any door. Those indoors discovered how fragile ordinary cabins truly were. Wind screaming through every crack, cold seeping through walls no matter how many quilts were hung, and roofs groaning and sometimes giving way under sudden, crushing weight. But deep inside the cave, inside her cabin, Clara was safe. The stones swallowed the wind's roar until it became a distant, muffled hum. The temperature held steady at 55 degrees. Ember stood calm in her stable, ears flicking only occasionally. Clara lit the stove, fed the mare, brewed coffee, and waited with a patience she had learned from years of listening to the land. She had built not merely a home, but an ark against the storm. And soon the storm would drive others to seek the shelter
Snow
she had
piled
created.
so
The
deep
shelter
that doors
everyone
froze
had locked
shut
because
from
when
inside,
nature
trapping
unleashed
families
its full until they hacked their way out
did
would
not
not simply
The
endure.
Cooper
It
family's
opened its
chimney
arms,
was
clogged with wind-driven snow. Smoke backed into the house, forcing them into a single back room wrapped in every blanket they owned, coughing and praying the fire wouldn't die. The Morrison house lost half its roof when a gust slipped under a loose shingle and peeled the structure open like tin. The town church, built to withstand ordinary storms, had every window shattered by the relentless wind, glass exploding inward while the congregation huddled beneath pews. But 5 miles away, deep inside the limestone cave, Clara and Ember were safe. The blizzard raged just beyond the entrance, a constant, living roar that shook the air. Yet inside, the chamber the wind could not reach. The temperature held steady at 55 degrees, warm enough that Clara needed only a small fire to keep the cabin comfortable. Snow never touched her roof. Wind never rattled her door. Ember stood calm in her stable, ears flicking occasionally at the distant thunder of the storm, but otherwise content. Clara spent the first evening tending the mare, brushing her down, checking for any chill, murmuring reassurance. "Good girl," she whispered. "We're all right. The cave is protecting us." Ember seemed to understand, gradually relaxing as she realized the terrible sounds outside could not hurt her here. The blizzard lasted 5 full days, non-stop snow, wind gusting over 60 miles an hour, and temperatures never rising above -20. In Silver Ridge, terror reigned. People burned through winter firewood in desperate attempts to stay warm. Food ran low because no one could reach outdoor pantries. Water lines froze solid. Several elderly residents slipped away despite their families' frantic efforts. Blankets, body heat, and prayers were not enough against the invading cold. But in the cave, life continued almost normally. Clara maintained her routine, caring for Ember, cooking simple meals on the stove, reading by lamplight, and using remarkably little firewood because the cave's massive thermal mass held heat like a living thing. On the 3rd day, she did something impossible for anyone in town. She walked calmly to the entrance passage, shielded from direct wind, and observed the storm from perfect safety. The world beyond was white chaos, swirling, blinding, deadly. Yet she could stand and watch it without immediate danger, like viewing hell from the gates of heaven. When the blizzard finally broke on the 6th day, Clara knew she had to check on Silver Ridge. The temperature had climbed to a merely bitter 10 degrees. The wind had fallen silent. She saddled Ember and rode the 5 miles to town, picking careful paths through drifts taller than a mounted rider. What she found was devastation. Buildings damaged or half collapsed, chimneys toppled, people huddled in whatever shelter remained. The town had survived barely, but the cost was steep. 7 dead from cold, dozens injured, and property damage that would take months, perhaps years, to repair. Sheriff Morrison spotted her approaching and stared as though seeing a ghost. "Monsieur, how did you survive?" "The cave," Clara replied simply. "Ember and I were completely protected, but we thought in a cave during a blizzard like that. The cave is what saved us. Constant temperature, no wind, stable structure. We were safer than anyone in town." Word spread like fire through dry grass. Clara Voss, the hermit girl in the cave, had weathered the worst blizzard in history in perfect safety, while civilized Silver Ridge nearly perished. Mayor Thompson approached soon after, face haggard from 5 days fighting to keep his family alive in a house that had proven fatally inadequate. "Your cave," he began, voice rough. Could it shelter more people? If another storm comes, the main chamber could hold 20 people and several horses if needed," Clara answered. "It's not huge, but it's safe. Would you open it as an emergency refuge for the town?" Clara looked at the ruined buildings, the traumatized faces, and the clear evidence that surface homes alone were not enough. "Yes," she said, "but people need to trust something they've mocked for a year. Can they do that after what we just lived through?" Thompson shook his head slowly. "They'll trust anything that works." The transformation was immediate and profound. The cave that had been a joke became the town's lifeline. The council voted to compensate Clara for supplies and upkeep. More importantly, attitudes shifted overnight. Families asked Clara to survey caves on their own land for possible reinforcement. The very idea of cave dwelling moved from ridiculous to revolutionary. Thomas Brennan, the town's master builder, came humbly to study her construction. "I need to understand this," he admitted. "I've built for 20 years, and my houses nearly killed my neighbors. Your cabin in a cave survived perfectly. What am I missing?" "You're not missing anything about building," Clara explained quietly. "You're missing something about location. A well-built house on exposed ground is vulnerable. A simple cabin in a protected cave is safe. It's not about the building alone. It's about the environment cradling it." Over the months that followed, as Silver Ridge rebuilt from the ashes of collapsed roofs and shattered lives, Clara's cave refuge became a quiet model. Not everyone could find or build in a cave. Suitable ones were rare, but people began to incorporate the principles she had proven. They sought natural protection, sheltered hollows, lee sides of ridges, and stands of trees that broke the wind. They understood at last that fighting nature head-on was less effective than working with its advantages. The cave became a true community resource. When severe weather threatened, families brought their elderly and children there for safety. Clara expanded the chamber thoughtfully, adding sturdy sleeping platforms along the walls, extra supply storage in dry alcoves, and even a secondary cooking area so larger groups could manage without crowding her private cabin. Ember's stable grew a little too, with room for other horses if needed. The town council voted modest compensation for upkeep and supplies, but Clara asked for little. She had built it for survival. Sharing it cost her nothing she valued. Years later, when a journalist from Helena arrived to write about the town that learned to hide from winter, Clara gave the interview in her cave cabin. Ember, now an old mare with gray around her muzzle, stood contentedly in the stable nearby. "Miss Voss," the journalist began, "when you built this, everyone thought you were mad. Did you ever doubt yourself?" Clara smiled faintly, running a hand along Ember's neck. "Every builder doubts, but I had studied caves, read survey reports, measured temperature swings, and calculated ventilation and stability. I knew it would work. Their mockery came from assumption. My certainty came from evidence." "Do you regret the isolation living apart from town?" "I'm not isolated," Clara said. "I'm protected. There's a difference, and I have Ember. She's better company than most, and she never once mocked my cave." Ember nickered softly, as if in full agreement, and Clara laughed, a rare, warm sound that echoed gently off the stone. "What would you say to people who still think cave dwelling is primitive?" "I'd say primitive only means older than we're used to. Humans sheltered in caves for millennia because they worked. We didn't abandon them because they failed. We forgot their advantages in the rush to build higher and wider. Sometimes the oldest solutions are the wisest." Clara Voss lived in her cave cabin until 1953, passing peacefully at 78 with Ember's successor, a gentle gelding named Ash, standing watch in the stable. The refuge passed to her niece with a firm condition that it remain open as an emergency shelter forever. Today, a bronze plaque marks the entrance. The cave refuge built by Clara Voss, mocked as madness, proven as wisdom. When surface homes froze and failed, the cave sheltered and endured, teaching that safety sometimes lies not in building higher, but in sheltering deeper. Modern survivalists and off-grid enthusiasts study Clara's design as an early masterpiece of passive environmental integration. Several families in the region have since built in or beside caves, rediscovering the advantages she demonstrated over a century ago. But in Silver Ridge, now a small but thriving mountain town, the deeper lesson lingers. They remember how quickly mockery can turn to gratitude when nature reminds us who truly rules. That crazy and wise can look identical until the storm reveals the difference. And that the quiet young woman everyone once laughed at understood survival better than all of them combined. The cave still stands, of course. Caves always do. The cabin inside needs occasional care, but its bones remain sound, cradled by stone older than human memory, and destined to outlast every wooden house ever raised against the sky. In the stable corner, though Ember passed decades ago, a small memorial remains, a worn horseshoe mounted on the wall with a simple inscription: Ember. She trusted the cave when humans doubted. Because in the end, Clara's story isn't only about a woman who built wisely. It's about trust. Trust in knowledge over opinion. Trust in quiet observation over loud tradition. And trust in a horse who followed her rider into the darkness and found not danger, but enduring safety. The blizzard that nearly erased a town could not touch the girl in the cave. The cold that stole lives could not reach the cabin wrapped in stone. And the lesson carved in limestone and living memory remains. Sometimes the strangest shelter is the strongest fortress. And the person everyone calls crazy is the only one truly prepared when winter shows its teeth. The cave remembers warmth, and so do we. That was the complete story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next ones. We'll meet again on Hill Destiny with another tale. Take care.